And just looking at the comments section right now, I have to say our show's core style remains exactly the same. We do not target any specific groups, but you know, if someone's logic is flawed, I am absolutely going to want to unpack it. So please, welcome. Throw all the contradictory events and wild geopolitical paradoxes my way. I am more than happy to take them on. Convince me.
We all hear you. But seriously, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. No matter what time zone you are tuning in from right now, welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe. And to kick off today's show, I want to test everyone, especially all of our Sip and Talkers out there, with what I can only describe as a geopolitical semantics boomerang.
A semantics boomerang. Okay, you have my full attention. Let's unpack this.
You'll love this. So let's look at the recent May 2026 Trump-Xi 2.0 summit in Beijing. During this massive high-stakes meeting, the Chinese leader laid down an incredibly strict, almost chemical-sounding red line. The exact quote is, "Taiwan independence and Cross-Strait peace are as irreconcilable as fire and water."
Sounds rigid, right? Very threatening.
Oh, definitely.
But here is where it gets really interesting. Our good friend Mickey recently came up with a totally wild thought experiment. He just took that exact logic, flipped the subject and the verb, and created a perfect mirror reflection from the other perspective.
Wait, what did he say?
Mickey said, the China problem, unification and Taiwan Strait peace are as irreconcilable as fire and water.
Wow. Okay, I literally need to take a sip of my coffee just to process that one.
Yeah.
Because Mickey's mere counterattack there is incredibly spicy.
Right.
But when you break it down, it is a flawlessly constructed physical logic. I mean, if you think about the reality on the ground, if unification requires the use of military force against a population that overwhelmingly wants to maintain the status quo, then unification and peace cannot physically coexist. They literally become the fire and the water. A sentence that starts off sounding like a standard propaganda slogan suddenly becomes this incredibly tight, logically perfect statement of cause and effect.
Yeah.
He basically used their own rhetorical spear to pierce their own shield.
And it does so beautifully. But, and here's the reality check for anyone listening who thinks we can just solve global conflicts with clever grammar. This is the danger of elite geopolitical games.
Yeah.
Logic is one thing, but reality is a completely different beast because Beijing threw out this fire and water pressure test at the summit to try and nail the Taiwan issue down as an absolute non-negotiable item. But if you look at the White House's official summary after the meeting, total silence, not a single mention of Taiwan. The entire summary focused heavily on economic cooperation, stopping fentanyl, and managing the Middle East.
Which brings us to our core mission for today. We are going to unpack what was really said at this summit, decode the subtext of this ultimate superpower poker game, and figure out if America is acting as a bulletproof vest for its allies or, if it's playing the role of a highly calculating merchant.
Yeah. Right, because what we're really looking at here is a battle of psychological subtext. It's a clash between two completely competing frameworks of logic. So let's dive into the mechanics of this fire and water rhetoric versus Mickey's mirror reflection.
Let's break down these two frameworks because understanding the why behind the words is crucial. On one side, you have what we can call the status quo logic.
Okay.
This is the behavioral justice view held by the West and the broader international community. In this view, the equation is simple, and it's based on the post-World War II order. The current status quo is peaceful. Therefore, whoever threatens to press the launch button to forcibly change that reality is, by definition, the security risk.
Right. If you are the one threatening to use force, you are the aggressor.
Exactly.
And that makes intuitive sense to most people. I mean, the status quo is fundamentally defensive. It's just a system asking to be left alone to function normally.
It does make sense to us. But then you have Beijing's framework, which we can call the aggressor logic, though they would frame it internally as structural sovereignty.
Structural sovereignty?
Right. In their view, which is rooted in their own historical narratives and regime legitimacy, unification is the only acceptable, inevitable end state. Because that end state is non-negotiable to them, they twist the causality. In their narrative, any resistance to that unification is framed as the actual provocation. By their logic, refusing to accept their terms is what destroys the foundation of peace.
Okay, let's make this tangible with a game theory analogy, because what you're describing is a classic high-stakes chicken game.
Oh, I love a good game theory analogy.
Right. Imagine two cars driving head-on toward each other at top speed. What Beijing is doing with this fire and water rhetoric is essentially ripping the steering wheel out of their own car, throwing it out the window, and yelling at the other driver, "If we crash, it's entirely your fault for not moving."
Wow.
They are artificially locking themselves into a collision course to force the burden of yielding entirely onto the other side.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. By throwing the steering wheel out the window, they're signaling that they physically cannot change course, so you have to.
But that brings up a huge question for you, and I know our listeners are probably screaming this at their speakers right now. If Mickey's mirrored logic, that unification requires force, and therefore unification is the real threat to peace, if that is so factually, undeniably accurate, why doesn't the international community just officially adopt it?
That's a great question.
Like, why doesn't the White House just stand up at the podium and say that out loud? Just call their bluff.
It's incredibly tempting, isn't it? But the answer lies in the dark, often frustrating mechanics of diplomatic crisis management. If the international community officially adopted Mickey's mirrored phrase, it would be logically satisfying.
Yeah, we would win the debate.
Right, we would win the debate. But practically, it would completely strip away the concept of strategic ambiguity.
Let's pause there, because strategic ambiguity gets thrown around a lot as a buzzword. How does that actually function as a mechanism of peace?
Think of strategic ambiguity as a necessary fog. It's a buffer zone. If you officially state that their core objective is an act of war, you back a global superpower into a rhetorical corner. You strip away their ability to save face internally.
And saving face is huge.
It's massive. In international diplomacy, saving face isn't just about politeness. It is a literal security mechanism. When you strip away an authoritarian regime's off-ramp, you force a cornered reaction. You risk turning a cold, manageable standoff into an immediate hot conflict.
So you have to leave them out.
Exactly. Sometimes the ugly truth of keeping the world spinning is that you have to tolerate completely illogical rhetoric from your opponent just to prevent the worst-case scenario from unfolding.
So it's about managing the friction, not winning the debate, which actually perfectly explains the White House's behavior at the summit. If directly challenging the locked steering wheel is too dangerous, how does a highly pragmatic, business-focused U.S. administration handle it?
They pivot.
They pivot. And to see how that pivot works mechanically, we have to look at Secretary of State Marco Rubio's recent interview in China, which was right on the heels of this summit.
It was a masterclass in this exact type of pivot. Despite the incredibly intense fire and water pressure test from Beijing, the U.S. strategy was remarkably, almost stubbornly calculated.
Stubbornly calculated is a good way to put it.
While Beijing was drawing absolute ideological red lines, the U.S. official summaries were laser-focused on practical domestic economic wins. We're talking about reindustrializing America, securing massive purchases of American Boeing airplanes, and moving huge amounts of agricultural products, specifically beef.
It's such a striking contrast. If we go back to our analogies, it's like a savvy merchant walking into a store. The store owner has this giant flashing not for sale sign padlocked onto a display case.
And that's the Taiwan red line.
Exactly. Now, an ideologue would walk in and start arguing about the display case, but the merchant completely ignores it, walks up to the counter and just asks, "Hey, how much for the cash register?" It's a total bypass. A total bypass.
But, I have to play devil's advocate here. Is the U.S. just turning a blind eye to a massive security threat to sell some stakes in planes? Are we selling out a democratic ally for trade concessions?
It definitely looks that way on the surface.
Okay.
But if you synthesize Rubio's statements and look at the actual policy levers being pulled, it is highly deliberate compartmentalization.
Compartmentalization.
Right. The underlying U.S. policy hasn't changed a single bit. They still fundamentally oppose any forced change to the status quo, and they are continuing to provide the military hardware and defensive capabilities to ensure that reality.
Right.
But, and this is the crucial mechanical difference, the U.S. refuses to let a democratic ally become a free bargaining chip in trade negotiations.
So by not engaging with the fire and water bait at the trade table, they deny that rhetoric any leverage over the American economy.
Yes. By remaining officially silent on that specific red line during the economic summit, the U.S. accomplishes two things simultaneously. First, they secure tangible economic engines for their own domestic basis, the planes, the agriculture.
Second, and this is where buying the cash register matters, they are quietly maintaining massive leverage in the background. Look at the American tech scene right now. While they are shaking hands on beef and airplanes, the U.S. is strictly, ruthlessly limiting the export of next-generation AI XPS to China.
Right, the AI GPS. And it's not just about keeping a competitive edge for the sake of corporate profits. It's about survival in the global tech hierarchy. As Rubio pointed out, the U.S. maintains a dominant position in AI and semiconductor GPS.
Absolutely.
These aren't just for fancy chatbots. We are talking about the foundational nodes and fabrication equipment that run next-generation military logistics and cyber warfare. It would be, frankly, ridiculous to sell the absolute cutting edge to a competitor whose explicitly stated goal is to reverse engineer that technology, leapfrog American dominance, and potentially use it against American interests.
Yeah, you don't hand over the blueprint to your own obsolescence.
You absolutely do not.
So you have this fascinating dynamic where the U.S. is keeping the geopolitical table perfectly balanced. They aren't flipping the table over the fire and water comments, but they are absolutely locking the doors to the tech vault.
It feels completely hypocritical on one level, right? We are essentially in a Cold War over microchips, but we are shaking hands over airplanes.
It is a bit surreal.
But it proves that if you want to keep the world running, you have to connect ideas through underlying logic, not just emotion. If China's strategy is to twist causality to justify their red lines, the U.S. strategy is to secure the economic engine so those red lines eventually become irrelevant. But, that duality doesn't stop in the Pacific.
No, it doesn't.
The Trump-Xi summit heavily covered global choke points, proving that even the fiercest competitors sometimes have to cooperate.
And this is one of the most revealing parts of the summit and Rubio's subsequent interview.
Yeah.
We have to look at the Middle East, specifically Iran. Iran has been actively attempting to militarize the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is a massive deal.
For our listeners who might not track maritime logistics, this is a vital international waterway, a massive global choke point that handles a huge percentage of the world's oil supply. Iran's strategy has been to try and charge illegal tolls for ships passing through, essentially taking international logistics hostage.
And the mechanism they are using to do this is fascinating. They are hiding behind what Rubio called a conventional weapon shield.
Right.
It's a highly calculated escalation. You build up tens of thousands of cheap conventional rockets and drones, so many that no defense system, no matter how advanced, could possibly shoot them all down.
You overwhelm them?
Exactly. Once you have that conventional immunity established, you use it as a shield to aggressively protect your nuclear ambitions because you've made the cost of a preemptive strike too high for anyone to stomach.
That's the exact playbook. And this led to a massive spike in tensions recently. The U.S. was on the verge of a major military response, an operation referred to as Project Freedom, to forcibly clear the straits and restore international shipping rights. But here is where the diplomatic mechanics get really interesting. The U.S. actually paused Project Freedom at the specific request of Pakistan, simply to give a diplomatic solution one last chance to breathe.
Okay, wait. I have to stop you there. Pakistan. Why does Islamabad have the juice to hit the brakes on a massive U.S. military operation? How does that diplomatic mechanism even work?
It's all about regional leverage. Pakistan shares a massive border with Iran and maintains complex intelligence networks and back channels that the West simply doesn't have.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. The U.S. ultimate goal isn't to start a war, it's regional stability. Pakistan essentially stepped in and offered a narrow diplomatic window, arguing that a full-scale kinetic strike would set the entire region on fire, flooding Pakistan with refugees and destabilizing their own fragile government.
That would be a disaster for them.
Exactly. So the U.S., acting pragmatically, gave the diplomatic back channel 48 hours to work.
That makes total sense. You leverage the neighbors to turn down the heat. But the real shocker from the summit wasn't just Pakistan stepping in. It was that the U.S. and China actually found absolute common ground on this issue.
They did. Beijing explicitly stated that they oppose Iran possessing a nuclear weapon, and they strongly oppose the militarization and tolling of the Strait of Hormuz.
And if you follow the logic of money, it makes perfect sense. China is the factory of the world. They rely on that global shipping lane and the free flow of oil just as much, if not more, than anyone else. A rogue Iran taxing the strait literally tanks the Chinese economy overnight.
Right. It hits their bottom line directly.
So if you are listening to this and wondering why your grocery bills or gas prices are tied to all of this, this is why. But it is wild to think about. We are in a zero-sum, cutthroat competition over AI, GPS, and tech dominance, but we are totally aligned on keeping international shipping lanes open.
That is the dual-track relationship of modern geopolitics. It's fierce protectionism regarding domestic industry, balanced with necessary alignment on global logistical choke points. To see how stark that contrast is, look at electric vehicles.
Oh, EVs are a huge sticking point.
During the interview, Rubio highlighted that Chinese EVs aren't just seen as a cheap market alternative, they are considered a direct national security threat to the United States.
Because of the mechanism behind them, right? It's not just that they are affordable cars. They are heavily subsidized by the state to intentionally undercut and completely wipe out the American auto industry. Plus, modern EVs are basically rolling supercomputers collecting massive amounts of data.
Precisely the issue. They are already flooding the European market, severely damaging legacy automakers there. The U.S. looks at that and says, we cannot allow our core industrial base to be hollowed out, and we cannot have millions of data harvesting machines on our roads. So you have this intense economic firewall being built against EVs and AI chips, while simultaneously, in the exact same summit, cooperating with that rival to stop Iran from mining an international waterway.
It really highlights how complex these relationships are. You don't just love or hate a country, you negotiate issue by issue, lever by lever. And speaking of how regimes operate, if China's strategy is to twist causality to justify aggression, let's look at another method of narrative control. Let's look at how that same authoritarian playbook operates just 90 miles from the U.S. shore in Cuba.
It's a tragic but perfect example of reality denial. During the interview, Rubio brought up a standing U.S. offer to Cuba. The U.S. has officially offered $100 million in strict humanitarian aid, specifically food and medicine for the Cuban people. There's literally only one condition attached to this money.
And let me guess the mechanism here. The condition is that the Cuban government can't touch a single dime of it.
That's exactly it. The only string attached is that the aid must be distributed by non-governmental organizations on the ground, specifically the Catholic Church.
Makes sense.
Why? Because authoritarian regimes use food as leverage. If the regime distributes it, they feed their loyalists and starve the dissidents. The U.S. refuses to hand $100 million in supplies to a regime that has a history of weaponizing aid against its own people.
So what did the Cuban government do when faced with this offer?
They utilized their control of state media, publicly went on television, and called the offer an absolute lie. They denied it even existed.
I am just flipping through my notes here to make sure I grasp the sheer audacity of that.
Sure.
Yes, they completely denied the existence of a $100 million lifeline while their people are lacking basic medicine. This is the ultimate tragedy of the information bubble.
It really is.
If you look at the Cuban diaspora, they are incredibly successful everywhere in the world except inside Cuba. The ingenuity is there, the cultural drive is there, but they are trapped inside a completely broken economic model. And the regime is so desperate to maintain control that they will literally block food and medicine and then lie to their citizens about it just to keep their political narrative intact.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, it all comes down to the overarching theme of this entire geopolitical landscape: narrative control.
Narrative control.
Whether it's Beijing framing a defensive posture as provoking a fire to justify their own military buildup, or Havana denying the existence of humanitarian aid to hide their systemic economic failure, authoritarian regimes absolutely rely on controlling the flow of information to survive. They have to shape an alternative reality because the actual reality destroys their legitimacy.
Well, because if the reality gets in, the logic falls apart. If the Cuban people know the food is waiting at the church, the regime looks cruel, not like a protector fighting off Western imperialism. If the international community focuses on Mickey's mirror logic, that forced unification is the real threat to peace, then Beijing looks like an aggressor, not a victim of provocation.
And the U.S. strategy across the board, whether it's navigating the tensions in the Pacific, managing the choke points in the Strait of Hormuz, or dealing with the Caribbean, is to systematically counteract these false narratives.
Right.
But they don't do it by shouting louder or getting into ideological screaming matches. They do it with cold economic pragmatism, building strategic alliances, and simply refusing to play the game by the opponent's rhetorical rules.
You just walk up to the counter and ask to buy the cash register.
He asked to buy the cash register.
Yeah.
Wow. I have to say, exhaling after all of that, I feel like half my brain cells are dead after unpacking that level of diplomatic chess, but it is incredibly satisfying to actually see the gears turning behind the headlines. If there is one thing this proves, it's that geopolitics is never, ever a simple multiple-choice question between black and white.
It is entirely shades of gray wrapped in economic leverage, and that really reinforces the core mission of Sip&Talk. We didn't walk through this thought experiment today to blindly criticize any country or to stir up mob emotions or point fingers. Our goal is always to take this cold, calculating diplomatic rhetoric, pair it with authoritative data, lay it all out objectively, and hopefully provide you with a set of eyes that can pierce right through the political fog.
I couldn't agree more with that mission. The world is staggeringly complex. And in an era where everyone is trying to build a narrative to trap you in an information cocoon, independent thinking is the absolute best bulletproof vest you can wear. By staying calm, looking at the data, and thinking rationally, we can all stand a little firmer in the storm.
So we want to hear from you.
Yes. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you were blown away by Mickey's fire and water mirror logic, or if you hold a completely different view on how these superpowers are playing their hands, we want to know. Please leave a comment or shoot us an email. And as always, feel free to order new topics. Whether it's international events, the latest shifts in the tech scene, or deep philosophical debates, let us know what you want us to decode next.
Sip and Talk. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
And hey, before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the Sip and Talk podcast so you never miss an episode. And be sure to check out our good friend Mickey's YouTube channel, Mickey to Life. His latest travel vlog is super fun. You definitely have to go watch it. It's a great palate cleanser after all this heavy geopolitical theory. See you next time. But before we officially sign off, I just want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We started today talking about how rigid words can be, how fire and water leaves no room for compromise. But if the world's two biggest rivals can quietly agree on keeping the shipping lanes of Hormuz open while publicly drawing impossible red lines elsewhere, you have to ask yourself in the global theater, are we ever really watching the actual play or just the shadows cast on the curtain?